In this second video on the Reformation, I will talk about the movement's second phase, that of the Radicals and Calvinists. These were the reforms of men who had never been embedded in the Catholic establishment, and who had none of Luther's concern for continuity and compromise with existing secular authority. It is not the story of England, France, or Germany, but of Scotland, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. This is not a tale of kings or queens, but of clergymen turned national figureheads and the revolt against Catholic monarchs. It was at this second stage of the Reformation that the idea of the separation of church and state was born. Marx described the Calvinist-inspired Dutch revolt of this period as the victory of the 16th century over the 15th. Unlike Lutheranism, which was very much follow the leader in questions of politics, Calvinism justified the overthrow of an idolatrous ruler. In his native Geneva, Calvin fashioned a new form of government that his critics called theocracy. Voltaire, the 18th century French philosopher, mused, "If they condemned celibacy in the priests and opened the gates of the convents, it was only to turn all society into a convent. Shows and entertainments were expressly forbidden by their religion, and for more than 200 years there was not a single musical instrument allowed in the city of Geneva." The fusion of church and state, instituted by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, excluded radical reformers such as the Calvinists and Anabaptists. The latter lobbied for religious tolerance, shared property, and practiced pacifism within their communities. Before the peace, the city of Münster was proclaimed a New Jerusalem in 1534. Wealth was distributed among citizens, polygamy was introduced, and independence from the Holy Roman Empire was declared, but it was promptly crushed by a combined Lutheran and Catholic army. The Anabaptists, on the other hand, were persecuted to the extent that the practice became a capital crime. This prompted their migration to more tolerant Eastern Europe and the recently discovered America, which had an influence on the inclusion of the separation of church and state in the US Constitution. A popular expression of Protestantism erupted in the German Peasants' War from 1524 to 26, which, alongside the abolition of serfdom, hunting and fishing rights, reduced taxes, and obligatory labour, included the community election and dismissal of priests. It was a revolt that Luther viciously condemned. He said that rulers should, as God's sword on earth, knock down, strangle, and stab the insurgents as one would a mad dog. Thereafter followed a quarter of a century of war between Catholics and Lutherans over the hundreds of the Holy Roman Empire's principalities. It concluded in the Peace of Augsburg, which can be summarized with the principle, whose region, his religion. This was a historic compromise, and ended Charles V's ambition to create a united Europe under one church. He abdicated the following year, giving the empire to his brother Ferdinand, and Spain and the Netherlands to his son, Philip II. The most important tenet of Calvinism is the conception of predestination laid out in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. It rules that God decided who will be saved, the elect, and who will be damned before he created mankind, and that no action in one's lifetime can alter that determined fate. There is therefore an emphasis on fulfilling God's will on earth and dedicating oneself to one's spiritual or secular calling. Calvin attempted to achieve this when he helped the city of Geneva restructure its institutions after it had thrown out its bishop. During John Knox's early childhood, Scotland was reeling from James IV's death at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, fought against the English to honour the Auld Alliance. His son, James V, continued the allegiance to the French by marrying the French noblewoman Mary of Guise. James V died at the Battle of Solway Moss, fighting Henry VIII's invasion, and his 6-day-old daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, succeeded him. Mary of Guise, his widow, ruled Scotland as regent, imposing tough punishment on emerging reformers like Patrick Hamilton, who was burnt at the stake in 1528 for talking about Luther to students at St Andrews. John Knox lived at the same time as Calvin, born in the generation after Luther, and was educated for priesthood, but could not afford to pay for the diploma. He travelled with the itinerant preacher George Wishart, who helped to popularise Protestant ideas in Scotland, and was executed in 1546. At St Andrews, Knox was taken prisoner by the French and forced to row as a galley slave alongside other Protestant clergy and nobles. After his liberation more than a year later, he spent time in exile in England, where he was influenced by the Church of England. Thereafter, Knox travelled to Geneva, where he met Calvin and was impressed by the institutions of the city. He then returned to Scotland, determined to implement his vision for the Kirk. Knox deposed Mary of Guise and founded the Church of Scotland in 1560, the following year. Mary Queen of Scots returned to Scotland from France in 1560 at the age of 18. She had no intention to re-Catholicize Scotland and practiced her religion in private. In England, Elizabeth I was attempting to consolidate her father's Reformation. This female rule in the British Isles was described as the monstrous regiment of women by John Knox. Knox saw Mary's court as decadent and full of French frivolity. Nobles interpreted her friendship with the Italian bass singer Rizzio as romantic, and there was a successful plot to murder him. Lord Darnley, her then husband and father of the future James VI and I, was implicated, and rumours began to circulate that he intended to brush his wife aside and become king through marriage. A plot to murder him was carried out. The Earl of Bothwell, suspected conspirator, married Mary. In the summer of 1567, there was an uprising against them, and Mary was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, where she was forced to abdicate in favour of James VI. The following year, she managed to escape captivity and raised an army of 6,000 who were defeated at Langside. Fleeing across the border to her cousin Elizabeth, she spent 19 years as prisoner of the English crown before being beheaded for her part in the murder of Darnley, allegedly proved by the casket letters in 1587.